Good afternoon, dear friends. My name is Ondřej Pilný. I'm the director of the Centre for Irish Studies at Charles University. You're very welcome at this debate about contemporary writers and Europe. Before we start, I would like to hand over to His Excellency Alan Gibbons, the Ambassador of Ireland, who's a co-organizer of this event.
You're all very welcome here this evening to the DOX Centre. It's fantastic to see all of you here this evening, and a special warm word of welcome to our four writers, two Czech and two Irish, that we're going to hear from this evening. And I suppose just very briefly, the idea behind this event emerged towards the end of last year. We were thinking about opportunities to reflect on the 20 years of Czechia's membership of the European Union. And Ondřej, together with colleagues in DOX, conceived of this event, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing, especially from Jan, from Tadhg, and from Pavla this evening, and hearing their reflections, a time of challenge and turmoil, but also a time of huge connectivity, huge opportunity, and so we all look forward to hearing their reflections this evening. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for making this evening special. Thanks a lot.
Some more thanks from me to Michaela Šilpochová, the artistic director of DOX, our long-term collaborator, and indeed all of the DOX team for making this possible here, and also to the Department of Foreign Affairs Ireland, without whose financial support this event could not take place. We'll start by me introducing just very briefly the four writers, and the structure of the debate will be that I will always at some point ask one of the writers to introduce an extract from their work and then read it, and then ask a few questions with others chipping in, and then we'll move on to the next writer, and hopefully there'll be still some time left towards the end for you to ask questions, so get ready for that. Okay. Who we have here in no particular order is Pavla Horáková first, who is a Czech writer, translator, and a radio broadcaster. She is the author of two books, or co-author of two books of non-fiction focused on the First World War. She's also written books for children. Her first novel, Teorie podivnosti, won the Magnesia Litera Award in 2019. And a special reason for welcoming Pavla here is that indeed her latest novel is called The Heart of Europe, Srdce Evropy. Then we have Jan Carson, who is a writer and community arts facilitator based in Belfast in Northern Ireland. She published 3 novels and 3 short story collections to date. Her novel The Fire Starters was the winner of the EU Prize for Literature in 2019. And her latest short story collection appeared only last month. It's called Quickly While We Still Have Horses. Then we have Jan Novák, who was born in Czechoslovakia, but spent almost 40 years living in Chicago. He writes both in English and in Czech. His first novel, The Willis Dream Kit, was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize, and he is I just need to be very selective here in this very, very long bio. He's also the winner of the Magnesia Litera for the novel called Zatím dobrý, So Far So Good. He's the author of an acclaimed biography of Milan Kundera. He's collaborated with the filmmaker Miloš Forman and co-authored his autobiography. He is the author of a couple of documentaries, film documentaries, focused on Václav Havel together with his son Adam. And he's also the translator of Havel's one-act plays and a recent translation of The Garden Party. And then we have Tadhg Mac Dhonnagáin, who writes in Irish, is based on the west coast of Ireland. He's written also books for children, non-fiction. He's a screenwriter, and in 2021 his novel Madame Lazare was the winner of the Irish Book Award and won a special mention at the European Prize for Literature. He's also a publisher. So far introductions, and I'd like to hand over to Pavla, because if we are to talk about Europe, then we need to talk about what Europe might possibly mean and where it might be located. So where else to start than with the heart of Europe?
So I'll first read an excerpt from The Heart of Europe in Czech and then in English. Am I supposed to introduce the novel? Well, it's based on my great-grandmother's memoir. She was born in 1898 and in South Moravia, and in 1912 she spent 6 months in Vienna babysitting for her eldest sister. And when I lived in Vienna, or stayed in Vienna for 2 months 4 years ago, I read the memoir and I walked in her footsteps in Vienna, and I created a contemporary character that actually walks in my great-grandmother's footsteps, comparing the situation of women back then and now, and also it takes place on the backdrop of the complex and intertwined histories of Czechia and Austria. And it shows how much we have in common. This is a chapter called Chudí příbuzní. Tady v muzeumskvartíru neboli muzejní čtvrti nejsem poprvé. Byli jsme tu vloni s katedrou na exkurzi, navštívili jsme Muzeum moderního umění a Muzeum Leopoldových a stihli jsme zajít i naproti přes ulici do Umělecko-historického muzea. Tenkrát by mě ve snu nenapadlo, že to do zdejších galerií budu mít jednou z postele jen pár kroků. Když večer usínám, nemůžu se nabažit vědomí, že pár desítek metrů ode mě se za zdmi ukládají k spánku všichni ti Klimtové, Šíleové a Kupkové a o kousek dál mnohem starší poklady z rozdrobené pražské kunstkomory Rudolfa II. Pozvali nás na recepci všechny zahraniční stipendisty v muzeumskvartíru, tedy i mě. Konala se v barokních sálech bývalých císařských koníren s výhledem na starou Vídeň. Ještě před 150 lety byl tenhle sál vyhrazen jen císařským důstojníkům z urozených rodin. A teď jsme tu samí civilisté. Pijeme sekt a jíme jednohubky, projevy pronáší pan ředitel, kurátoři a kurátorky muzeí a dokonce 2 ministryně. Nechápu, jak je možné, že já, holka z maloměsta, nemanželské dítě, stojím tady, uprostřed Vídně, v tomhle sále, vedle členek rakouské vlády a klidně si s nimi můžu potřást rukou. Představuju si svou prababičku Kateřinu a její sestry a všechny ty ostatní služebné z moravských a českých dědin, odsouzené k těžké práci s pramalou prestiží, přistěhovalkyně, které do smrti mluvily s cizím přízvukem a jejich jména prozrazovala, že přivandrovali kdo ví odkud. Moje němčina je slušná, ale klidně se tu bez ní obejdu. Každý tu se mnou mluví anglicky, všichni jsme na tom stejně, jsme si rovní i v jazyce. A přestože jsem jenom studentka, je mi coby zahraniční badatelce prokazována veškerá čest. Samozřejmě, že není důvod cítit se kvůli tomu nepatřičně. Naopak je v pořádku, že mě už nikdo nesoudí za můj nemanželský, plebejský a slovanský původ. I když za ta privilegia nevděčím své přičinlivosti, ale prudkému příklonu k humanismu a rovnoprávnosti posledních desetiletí. Na konci 19. století byla Vídeň druhým největším českým městem. Čechů to bylo na 100 000. Ve skutečnosti jich bylo možná až 3krát tolik. A kromě nich tu ještě byli rodáci z českých zemí, jejichž mateřštinou byla němčina. Nejdřív do Vídně přicházeli služebníci a muzikanti šlechticů, pak řemeslníci, služky, kuchaři, pekaři, cukráři, kojné, kočí a cihláři. Jako kdyby Češi byli něco jako chudí příbuzní. Jsem kousek vyškrtla, aby to bylo kratší. Kateřina měla ve Vídni 3 nejstarší sestry. Všechny 3 si ve Vídni našly ženichy a staly se Rakušankami. Kateřina o nich mluví jako o matčiných oblíbených dcerách. Možná matce byly jen vzácnější a možná měla špatné svědomí, že je už jako děti odložila a nevěnovala se jim. Někdy se mi zdá, že máme sklon dívat se na dávný venkovský život jako na idylu, jako na ztracený ráj, jako na dobu neskažených a ryzích vztahů. Ale když si čtu o Kateřině širší rodině, moc mi do té představy nezapadá. Její matka o tolik dětí přišla a přece 3 dcery poslala pryč a tu nejmladší odstrkovala a málem ji nechala schromnout. Vídeňské sestry se také zbavovaly svých dětí, jak mohly. Zopakovali tak vzorec ze svého dětství. Myslím, že si dnes příliš idealizujeme i mateřství. Není každé dítě vymodlené, dokonce vítané a každá matka Madonna. Možná je blízkost a láska přepych, který si lidé můžou dovolit jen tehdy, když mají hmotný dostatek. V dobách nouze je možná největším projevem lásky poslat dítě kamkoliv, kde se dosyta nají. And now in English, translated by Ondřej Pilný. It's a chapter from the Heart of Europe called Poor Relatives. This isn't my first time at Vienna's Museumsquartier. Our department came here on a field trip last year. It wouldn't have occurred to me, even in my dreams, that the galleries will once be only a few steps away from my bed. Falling asleep in the evening, I relish the fact that a couple of 100 meters away, behind a wall, all these Klimts, Schilers and Kupkas are turning in for the night, and the much older treasures from the dispersed Prague Kunstkammer of Rudolf II are doing the same just a bit further afield. We were invited to a reception, all of us with an international scholarship at the Museumsquartier. It took place in the Baroque rooms of the former imperial stables with a view of old Vienna. A mere 150 years ago, this hall would have been reserved strictly for imperial officers from noble families. And now it is all civilians. We're drinking sparkling wine and eating canapés, and speeches are delivered by the director, museum curators, and even 2 government ministers. I'm astonished. How come that I, a small town girl, born out of wedlock, am standing here in the middle of Vienna, in this hall, next to women who are members of the Austrian government, and I'm free to shake hands with them? I imagine my great-grandmother, her sisters, and all those other servants from Moravian and Bohemian villages, confined to hard labor with 0 prestige attached, migrants who spoke with a foreign accent until their dying day, and whose names gave away their origins in God knows where. My German is decent, but I can get by without it. Everyone speaks English to me here. We are all on the same footing, equal in language as well. And despite being only a student, I enjoy the full honors of an international researcher. It is right that nobody looks down upon me because of my illegitimate plebeian and Slavonic origin any longer, although my privilege isn't due to my diligence, but rather the forceful turn towards humanism and equality in the recent decades. Vienna was the 2nd largest Czech city at the end of the 19th century. The Czech inhabitants numbered around 100,000. In fact, there may have been up to 3 times as many, and a part of them, there were also those born in the Czech lands whose mother tongue was German. First to come to Vienna were noblemen's servants and musicians, then craftsmen, maids, cooks, bakers, confectioners, wet nurses, coachmen and brickmakers, as if the Czechs were poor relatives of sorts. My great-grandmother Kateřina had 3 eldest sisters in Vienna. All found a husband in the city and became Austrian. Kateřina speaks about them as their mother's favorite daughters. It might have been that They felt only more precious to their mother, her suffering from bad conscience for having abandoned them as children and paying little attention to them. I sometimes feel that we tend to perceive rural life in the past as an idol, as paradise lost, as a time of uncorrupted, pure relations. When I read about Kateřina's family, however, this image seems to crumble apart. Despite losing so many children, her mother still sent 3 daughters away and pushed aside the youngest, whom she nearly allowed to go lame. The Viennese sisters were getting rid of their children as fast as they could too, repeating the pattern from their childhood. I think that we idealize motherhood too much as well. Not every child is a godsend, or even welcome for that matter, and not every mother is a Madonna. Closeness and love might be a luxury which people can afford only in a situation of plenty. At a time of dearth, the supreme act of love might be to send the child wherever food isn't scarce.
Thank you so much, Pavla. Perhaps a slightly provocative question. The novel is called Heart of Europe, and here, particularly in Prague, we tend to think that the heart of Europe is really in Prague. Well, I've personally been to a place which was built as the geographical center of Europe, and that's actually located in Lithuania. So where is the heart of Europe?
Well, I asked that question myself, or rather my character asked that question herself in the novel, and the whole chapter is devoted just to this particular question. There are many cities in Europe that pretend to the title of the Heart of Europe. There are many places around Europe that pretend to the title of the geographical center of Europe, and also Central Europe is a pretty vague title. So I'm not gonna give away any spoilers. It's all in the book.
Okay, fair enough. Perhaps on a slightly more serious note, and this is a question for the whole panel, really. How is Europe defined for you? I mean, is it something that's defined by borders these days? Is it defined by values or a frame of mind?
I think to me, growing up, I've always felt that in Northern Ireland we are kind of the car park of Europe, sort of tucked on the edge. But you know, the word Europe to me growing up always kind of conjured up images of ideas and thinking and art and creativity and these cosmopolitan people who didn't look like they ate potatoes all the time, because I think most folks in Ireland do look a wee bit like that. So it was kind of an interesting thing for me to grow into my Europeanness and to feel like I was actually a European citizen. And that has really come more and more as I've journeyed with writing and reading work in translation from other European writers and finding there not just the differences, but also so many similarities and issues that we have in common. And I guess I'm from Northern Ireland. I grew up in the Troubles, and I often get paired with what I like to call writers from other difficult places. And I just have found those conversations so incredibly meaningful, because we have so much to learn from what conflict looked like and post-conflict situations have looked like in other European places. And I hope that maybe they have something to learn from our journey as well. So it's that sharedness, but also unique difference as well. We were at a gig last night, brilliant Irish traditional music being played, and do you know, it was really heartening to watch lots of Czech young people Irish dancing. It was just fab to be like, there's an appreciation of our culture in other places, and also a way of making it peculiar to their own place too. And to me, that's the joy of being European. A little bit of yourself and a little bit of learning from other people.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I'd say Jan is a great rugby player. the way he just did that with the mic. For me, growing up in the west of Ireland, in the rural west of Ireland, and discovering Europe, as it were, also kind of living a bilingual life as a speaker of both Irish and English, because everybody who speaks Irish also, unless you're very old or very, very young, you also speak English. So that kind of bilingualism is just our kind of default, way of life, and it's common in Europe. It's much more common in mainland Europe than it is in lots of places in mainland Europe than it is in the Anglophone world in general, because America really dominates the Anglophone world, and there's a certain kind of a linguistic arrogance sometimes about some Americans who just kind of, they expect and assume that everybody in the world speaks English or American, and if you don't, well then, like, what's going on? That this you're not providing the level of service that they expect or something. So I have always felt that being a bilingual Irish person and that bilingualism being kind of at the core of my creative output is as much a reflection of my European identity as it is of my Irishness. And I'm dying to hear what Jan has to say.
I feel like I have to stick up for the Americans. In America, we say, an Englishman will treat you as an equal if you treat him as a superior. I didn't realize I was a European when I was growing up here. I was Czech, and I realized I was European after I got to Chicago. Although the American idea of Europe is quite distorted. Everybody knew about Amsterdam because it was a place where you could buy marijuana legally. But as far as Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia, nobody had any idea where it's at. Even I'll be reading from a book about my stay here for a year. I had 2 American kids. I was trying to teach Czech in America. I was hopeless, so I decided to take them over there, stick them into Czech schools, and rob them of their self-confidence a little bit. And it worked, and I wrote a book about the year we spent here and about Prague. So when we were leaving in 92, leaving Chicago for a year in Prague, everybody was aghast. There's war. You're taking your kids to a war. Of course, the war was in Yugoslavia. The geographical knowledge in America is just poor. But so Europe for me, and when I look back at it, it's great that Europeans are not killing each other the way they used to. I'm from Kolín, and there was a huge battle between Prussians and Austrians right outside of Kolín, and all the farmers climbed into the trees to watch the Germans kill each other, and some of the remains are now in Kutná Hora, in that great Oshuri. There's a church with everything, the altar and stuff, out of human bones of Germans. So, I'm glad we progressed.
Thank you very much.
There are so many Europes, obviously, and it's difficult to give one definition, and so diverse that visiting Romania and France are two very different experiences. From within, I would say that Europe defines itself by aspiring to a set of values. But as an insider, for me, it's difficult to define Europe because ask a fish to define water. But an eye-opening experience for me was 2 years ago when I was at the international writing program at the University of Iowa, where I was staying with 30 writers from all over the world, literally all over the world. And as I was listening to them, I could sort of see Europe through their eyes. And it wasn't a pretty sight, I must admit, because I believe that from outside, Europe is seen as a place of privilege. And not only in terms of the per capita GDP or the healthcare and welfare systems, but also the preservation of nature or the abundance of historical monuments that we have here. And coming from the former Eastern Bloc, I never felt I enjoyed any kind of privilege. But there, among the international writers, I was automatically lumped together with the rest of Europe, with the former colonial powers. And I was like, no, we had nothing to do with that. But anyway, I realized that, yes, Europe from the outside looks like a place of privilege. And with that privilege, I believe, comes responsibility.
Thank you very much. Could I hand over to Jan, who's going to read an extract from a very recent short story. But perhaps it'd be good if you introduced the context a little bit.
Yes. First of all, can I say thank you for having me in Prague. This is my first time here, and it has been absolutely gorgeous for the last few days. Sorry about the rain the other day that we brought with us from Ireland. We'll take it home with us now. I feel a little bit duplicitous sitting here tonight because I am kind of not an EU citizen anymore. So I have a British passport. I also have an Irish passport. So my identity is kind of under constant flux when it comes to what it means to be European at the minute. And I very much grew up in a British household, so I'm the only person in my entire extended family that has an Irish passport. And increasingly, I do feel very, very Irish. In 2019, the Irish judging panel picked my novel about loyalism, about young men who identify as British in Belfast, to represent Ireland at the EU Prize for Literature. And to me, that was such a gracious, open-minded, nuanced approach that it really felt like I'd found a place to belong in the Irish writing community. And who wouldn't want to be an Irish writer as well, with the kind of weighty shoulders that we get to stand upon. So what the excerpt I'm going to read tonight is a little bit complicated. In Northern Ireland, our school system is still 91% segregated, which I find a shocking statistic. And that means that I went to a Protestant girls' grammar school, and I didn't learn any Irish, and I didn't learn any Celtic mythology, and I didn't learn a single bit about the history of my own country. I learned empire history. And colonialism has lots of different negative impacts, but some of the negative impacts it has are actually on the colonisers. So it's a shameful thing to arrive at 25 and realise that you don't understand the history of your own island. And that's what this excerpt's about. So it's from a short story called One Hander. I have to give you a kind of caveat. I'm a magical realist, so quite a lot of my stories are a bit bizarre. This one is about the Red Hand of Ulster, which is the white flag that you might have seen with the red hand in the middle of it. And it's about a girl who wakes up one morning and discovers that the Red Hand of Ulster is in her fridge. So there's an actual decapitated hand in her fridge. And when she discovers that, she also, in this excerpt, discovers that the Red Hand has disappeared from every flag across Northern Ireland. It's nowhere to be seen, it's just in her fridge. And she begins to sort of understand that this might be because she's neglected some of her own kind of unionist British identity. So it's kind of a weird story, but bear with me. I've also apologised to Tadhg in advance and anyone else who loves traditional Irish music, because she does take the piss out of it in this section. It is not me speaking, it is the character. Here we go. It's gone, said Jim. Vanished, scarpered, done a runner. There's not a single red hand to be found in Ulster. All the flags are missing their hands, and the Red Cross too. All the crests and signs and official letterheads. Even the Ulster Halls had lost the wee red hand that used to sit above its door. Seriously, says Laura. Seriously, said Jim. Has somebody nicked them? The police don't think so. How would you ever get all them hands off all those flags and signs and whatnot? Sure, there's hundreds and thousands of them and they've all vanished. It's like they were never there in the first place. Pure David Blaine stuff. Some sort of magic trick, they think. Your lot's blaming Sinn Féin, or maybe the priests. Could be some sort of curse against the prods. The Red Hand's a massive deal to prods. You'll know that yourself, Laura. Sure, your daddy was always waving it around. Jim was right. Her daddy had made a point of always getting his photo taken in front of or holding a big Ulster flag. There was a picture of her and her brothers at the 12th taken when she was only 3 or 4. Her ma had drawn Union Jacks with face paint on their right cheeks, and on the left a wee red hand, the fingers fat and sausagey like the cartoon notion of a hand. That had been the summer before they left at her daddy. When he'd seen them done up for the parade, he'd made them pose for a photo. Her ma said he had it up on his wall in the prison. He'd written on it with a permanent marker, "Loyal Sons of Ulster," as if Laura didn't count. As a child, Laura had never been taught the story behind the Red Hand. They'd not gone in for Irish legends in the Protestant primary she'd been sent to. Her daddy would have had a conniption if he thought his wee ones were getting a grounding in Gaelic shite. God, Queen, country and a bit of maths was all he'd required of the education system. Anything more might corrupt his weans. Over the years, Laura had tried to educate herself, not just on the stories. She'd also read up on the Easter Rising and the history of the South. Daniel O'Connell, Charles Sturt Parnell, Michael Collins and the rest of the lads. She'd gone out of her way to enjoy trad music, though it never really sat right with her. She could hear her daddy at the back of her head taking the piss in a fake Irish accent. Fiddle-dee-diddle-dee-dee, Fenian music. What's next, Laura? River dance? Yon music's for fruits, so it is. Derek would sometimes ask Laura what was what when it came to Irish stuff. History and places in the South, how you said words in Irish, simple wee words like hello and goodbye. Mostly Laura didn't know. She felt a deep sort of shame for her ignorance. Derek knew lots of Polish stories. He was dead set on passing them on to his niece and nephew. They should know who they were and where they came from, though his sister wanted them raised as Belfast kids. She sent them to Scouts in the Church of Ireland and also up to Irish dancing, which happened in the parochial hall. She taught them how to slur their consonants and sharp their vowels like local wains. She'd named them Lindsay and Christopher and made them take their father's name. Derek thought this was a crying shame. Laura agreed with Derek. She was determined to learn more about her own heritage. And by this she meant all of Ireland, not just the tight corner she'd grown up in. She got a book out of Ballyhack Library. It was meant for children, but it covered all the basics. Laura liked the pictures. They helped the stories stick in her head. She'd learnt enough to pass herself on Cuchulainn and Maeve and Concobar and the giant Finn McCool, whom she'd already encountered on a school trip to the Giant's Causeway. The book had skated over the Red Hand of Ulster. There were that many versions of the story. Laura tried to remember the details now and could only summon the vaguest notion of what the legend actually entailed. 2 big lads, maybe 3, had been fighting to claim Ulster as their own. Were they in boats or on horses? She couldn't recall, but did remember the first to lay hand on the land would have the run of it. One smart arse with a sword saw a loophole in the arrangement. He'd cut his own hand off at the wrist and pitched it onto Ulster soil, and in doing so become king, or maybe lord of the place. Laura couldn't remember which one it was. She could have asked Jim, but she didn't want him to think her unduly interested in the hand.
Thank you so much. Could I take that concept just a little bit further? What would not that?
What is further than decapitated hands?
No, just the disappearance of not that the flag itself, of course, would have been originally a nationalist symbol, as in broad sense of nationalist. But what would happen if all of them disappeared? All these flags that various Europeans keep on waving.
I think flags and symbols, where I come from, are a really important thing, and it's been a really hard kind of journey for me of you know, growing up feeling very British and very proud of things like the Union Jack and the association with the monarchy, and you know, even lots of the symbols and signs of British identity. And for me and a lot of people of my generation who were raised that way, we're becoming increasingly aware that the British government isn't really interested in Northern Ireland. And that realisation hasn't quite trickled down to a lot of the more militant unionists yet. And so they tend to fly their flags even higher and have more parades and shout louder about the signs and symbols because it's one of the only things that they have left. And I find it funny, I've thought about this a lot recently because we're currently adapting one of my books for TV, and it's an English author who's doing the screenplay, and she doesn't quite understand what all of the symbols mean. And she's been over to Belfast and she can't understand how a symbol can be so contentious and so offensive when placed out of context. So I'll give you an example of this. Do you have Tesco's here? Mm-hmm. So Tesco's is all over the UK and Ireland, and West Belfast would be a very nationalist part of Belfast. So mostly people who feel Irish live up there. And guess what? They didn't sell very much of the merchandise for the King's coronation. But to me, it's really odd that somebody didn't even think that, why would we stock our store full of Union Jacks up here? So that kind of thinking sometimes doesn't trickle down. I would get rid of all the flags, to be honest. They can just, in the wrong hands, they can be such contentious and difficult things.
And does the kind of, any notion of Europe come into education, schools, etc., in your experience in Northern Ireland? Like, to what extent, you know, that whole notion of that, at least in a broad sense, even after Brexit, we could still be part of Europe? Or, yeah.
I think there's a desire there. It's just increasingly more complex and difficult to, you know, before I'm translated into 14 different countries now, and before Brexit I could just get paid and pay my taxes in Britain. I now have to declare temporary tax residency in every one of those 14 countries, or I'll get taxed in each one of them and then taxed again in Britain. So that kind of pernickety legislation makes people just not bother. You know, if you're going to bring a theatre production or like a band to play in Northern Ireland, there's so much more legislation to be able to get them there. And so there is this, well, why bother then? We'll just go to Dublin and play there. And that feels like a backward step for us. Sorry, I'll say this very quickly. During the 70s and 80s and even the early 90s before the peace agreement in Northern Ireland, we were incredibly insular. Very few people moved there because why would you move to the middle of a war zone? Tourists certainly weren't coming to visit, and even touring bands wouldn't come because there might be a bomb scare, they might not get to play. And that insularness of just listening to ourselves in a kind of echo chamber kept our young people from being open-minded and being able to access what else was going on in the rest of the world, and to be part of these important conversations about gender parity and the environment and big issues. So the fear for me is that the more difficult it is for people to come and for us to go to other places, the more insular we become again.
Okay, thank you very much. So actually, implicitly, Europe is getting defined against insularness, which I think is a really fair point. Yeah. Could I pass on to Jan, who, you know, to just move to a completely different context? If you could introduce the extract you'll be reading.
I'll be reading from a book, like I said, about Prague, called Kamis, Crooks, Gypsies, Spooks and Poets. Komouši, grázlové, cikáni, fízlové a básníci. The subtitle of the book is 13 Books of Prague in the Year of the Great Lice Epidemic. This is from the Book of Memories. a chapter called Ganja. In 1979, you took a risk by going back to the communist Czechoslovakia with a foreign passport if you were born there, like I was. If the government wanted to do anything to you, then they had you and no one was going to help you. So traveling back to the old country, you were betting on your own insignificance, which had been certified in a preliminary way when the Czech embassy gave you their visa. They usually did not give it to people they deemed personas non gratas. Still, there had been cases of Czech emigres with valid visa winding up in Czech prisons. In 1979, I was 26 years old. I had a visa, was a nobody, yet sitting aboard the Soviet-made plane of the OK Airlines and heading for the Ruzyně airport, I still broke into a cold sweat. A few days before my flight to Prague, I'd visited my Jamaican ganja dealer in Chicago's Hyde Park. I needed an ounce of the best shit you got, the kind of shit you smoke. Cool, man. I mean this. You're gonna open new markets in the East with this. Blood clot. My Jamaican connection smelled a rat. Yet his ganja had me traveling a 20-minute car ride all night long. A single hit off a fat joint he'd thrown into the deal kept sending waves of heat down my back as I was driving home, my mind drifting and skipping, before suddenly remembering, you're driving, goddammit. I never talked to myself out loud. Concentrate. Every vowel packed a monstrous echo, even before the deja vu nailed me. Shit. I've been here already. I've driven down this way just now. I frantically tried to recall whether, by mistake, I'd gotten off the expressway somewhere and wound up getting lost in the side streets. Maybe. Did I have to double back? I couldn't recall anything of the sort, which didn't mean that it didn't happen. I only knew for damn sure I'd just driven this way. And then I catch myself again. 80 miles an hour, you idiot, with drugs in the car. And right away, I'd come to once more. Fuck, I've been here already too. I was woozy with fatigue by the time I made it home. As I was splashing cold water on my face, Quasimodo began to ring all the bells of Notre Dame right behind me. It was the house phone, sounding so majestic you didn't even feel like picking it up. The dealer was calling, shopping for compliments. So, white man. Oh yeah, blood clot. You got on that pussy yet? Hey, Rasta, we're gonna open some markets with this shit. You got the whole of my hometown of Kolín, man. Everything south of the Elbe and everything north of the Elbe. We gotta put it in ink, man. Every Indian knows the white man can be trusted. Wanna cruise back here, Rasta? I thought of the rubber expressway stretching on and on between him and me. Rasta ambushed. The reefer was divine, so I rolled up 20 fat joints, bought a carton of Lucky Strikes, and put my wife's nimble fingers to work. She swore at me the whole time, calling me the pride of idiots. I was jail-bait. She wasn't going to see me for 10 years, but I had her in a bind because I was determined to get that Rasta ganja to Kolín. Honey, either you help me or I'll have to do it myself, and you know how it's gonna look. You know it's gonna look really pitiful if I do. We undid the cellophane wrapper off one end of the carton, unpeeled the flap of the box, took out a pack, and carefully split the folded tail of the wrapper on its bottom. We shook out all the cigarettes and stuffed the fat joints inside, then carefully folded and glued everything back together with a clear glue. When we were finished, the carton of Lucky Strikes looked just a tiny bit off, but you had to look closely to see it. I bought another carton of Lucky Strikes as a decoy and told myself that you practically couldn't tell the difference between the two boxes. I'd been debriefing recent visitors of Prague, and they all agreed that the Czech customs people seemed to be staging some sort of a slowdown. These people thought that nowadays, if you had a big enough suitcase, you could smuggle Solzhenitsyn himself to Prague. I was all right until I changed planes in Frankfurt, West Germany. Suddenly, 30,000 feet above the earth, with no more landings scheduled, I remembered Murphy's Law. If anything can go wrong, it will. And then I remembered his second law. I was an optimist. And then I remembered all the championship canines of Czechoslovakia and the throw away the key drug sentences there. I felt the shirt stick to my back, but the ganja lay in my suitcase, which lay in the belly of the plane. So the die was cast. The OK Airlines poured you as much Pilsner or Quell as you care to drink to compensate for the bumpy flights in Russian planes. So I was wobbly and slurry by the time we landed in heavy fog in Ruzyně. The alcohol dulled the panic attack, so I lifted my suitcase off the conveyor belt and lugged it to a young woman in the customs booth. She stamped my passport, barely glancing at me. I threw the suitcase into a cab and didn't look at it for a long time. We were driving through the dark streets of Prague by the time I noticed the zipper on my suitcase was partly undone. The gap was wide enough to stick my whole arm through. I groped around the clothes. The cartons of Lucky Strikes were gone. Gone too were the 2 bottles of Pinch, the Scotch whiskey I brought from my relatives. You ain't had no lock on that zipper? The cabbie smirked. Well, then the baggage handlers at Ruzyně got your booze. Them goddamn rip-off artists will pinch your glass eye if you ain't careful.
Thank you so much. Now, this is a story that's set in the 1970s, and it'd be just utterly fatuous to ask you about how this place has changed since. But perhaps what might be a better question is, because you came back here in the early 1990s and sort of divided your time between here and Chicago, as far as I know.
No, I lived here for 2 school years, and then I came back in 2008.
Mm-hmm. So when you came back to live here for the 2 years, how different did it feel in terms of, attitude to the rest of Europe, for instance?
Well, it was an interesting time. While Germany was uniting, Czechoslovakia was splitting up, which seemed a wrong idea to me at the time. It was a wild time. It was just the mentality of the people was just being adjusted at such a rapid pace that, for example, after some time here, I found a store that had ramen soup. This soup where you pour some hot water on it and you have a dinner. So I bought some, and then when we used them up, I went back there to buy some more, and the guy didn't have it. And so I said, okay, when will you have it? He says, never. I said, oh, why? Is it such a problem to order it or to get it from someplace? He said, no, every time I get it, they buy it all up. The guy wanted to have an order on his shelf, and he wanted to have one of each items that he wanted to sell, and people like me were buying it. So that was the mentality here. I mean, people were, after 40 years of communism, they didn't, and this was a businessman. This was a guy who was trying to run a business. That's what.
Mm-hmm. And during your 2 years here, did you get in touch with writers and artists much? I know that you knew Václav Havel and worked with Miloš Forman, etc. Did you get to talk to them, or did you get to talk to some of the younger ones at that time?
We old writers are not interested in young writers. But I was looking up to older writers who were not interested in me. I used to go to have a beer at Bohumil Herbal's table at the Golden Tiger. That was wonderful. It was, to my mind, he's the greatest Czech writer who ever lived. And it was a real privilege to just hang out with him. And he always collected all these. He was really, we never talked about writing. It was all about, crime, latest crimes, and latest scandals. And there were people, there was always one or two chairs at his table where somebody was interested, somebody who just got released from jail, so let's say, would sit and there would be an interesting conversation. And then when he got drunk, he could recite Yesenin for hours, it seemed like. It was wonderful.
To come back to Havel one more time, that's perhaps a question for everybody, and concerns the position of the writer generally in the world, particularly as we're negotiating pretty difficult times with Putin's imperialist war in the Ukraine in particular. One of the things that Havel asserted repeatedly was that culture is a principal means of self-reflection of society, and he would have extended this not just to sort of Czech writers reflecting on Czech society, but generally on all of Europe, East and West. It was remarkable that in the late 70s, early 80s, with no access to whatever was out there beyond the Iron Curtain, he actually had that kind of European sort of frame of mind, and was able to make quite pertinent comments on the state of Western democracies. Do you think this is an idea that we should subscribe to? We should take seriously that if you practice something like literature or the visual arts, that you're actually serving as some kind of a mirror to society, or is this something that if you do that, then it just curbs your freedom, creative freedom as a writer?
It's a heavy burden I don't want to carry.
I think if you were to do it too directly, then it would become a sort of a branch of journalism in a certain way, which would be a different thing from art, which is much more elliptical and it arises from personal experience, I think. But I mean, I think you can say a lot about universal subjects through the particular. That you find the universal in the particular. For example, a novel that impressed me this year is a young writer from the north of Ireland called Michael McGee, who wrote a novel called Close to Home, and it's about a young man in the nationalist West Belfast, kind of trying to find himself. And really the whole kind of atmosphere of the novel is the trauma of the Troubles. It's the trauma of the world post-Troubles, as expressed by his own mother's experience of surviving the Troubles as a young mother, and also his brother, who was completely just falling apart, really, and this desperate problems of drugs and all sorts of issues, and so that's a particular experience of a particular place and a particular time, but it also is a very universal thing. I mean, you think of the children of Gaza right now. I mean, what they're going through, and how if one of those children you see on these video clips, who's 3 years old, if they survive to be 83, like how all that will kind of, how they will have to live with all that throughout their lives, So I think that a particular experience can say a lot about a universal experience.
Thank you.
I guess like this is a kind of question about art and activism, and I would agree with these two. I don't think it is an artist's job to do anything except make art. And when you do set out with an agenda, often the kind of beauty of the piece or the profundity of it gets sacrificed to kind of mechanisms of trying to get your point across. But I have been thinking about this a lot recently because we're in this moment where artists are often being called to speak into kind of crisis moments in the world that are taking place. And I think perhaps we're coming in at the wrong end of the spectrum. Like, I'd like to think that somebody could write a poem that would change people's attitudes about some of the heinous things that are going on in the world today, or create a film or paint a picture. But I think that very rarely happens. I think what art does is at the other end of the spectrum, which is not in the reactionary moment, it's in the long term. And I've seen in Northern Ireland that community art and a lifetime exposure for our children to reading and cinema and theatre and being given spaces to think with nuance and to empathise with other people's perspectives and to practice objectivity. Art can do that in a very slow, kind of like measured way that does actually change societies and make people change their perspectives and be more open-minded and caring and engaged with a lot of these big issues. I think the question at the minute is what do we do in the reactionary moment? Because as artists, we're sitting in a moment now where the world's in crisis. We don't have 30 years to slowly change society. So I often come back to and it's exhausting and tiring, but it feels like we have to be kind of present in both ends of the spectrum. That yes, artists are engaged in protest and artists are engaged in these acts now, but you're also not sacrificing your long-term practice, that you're continuing to create and grow and challenge yourself as an artist. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
I believe that above all, a writer has to be honest, and if that honesty involves speaking out against injustice or addressing political or social issues, that's perfect. But if that honesty means rather staying away from such subjects, because as they say, silence speaks volumes, I think that's also good, because being silent about certain topics also is a statement. But also I believe that writers or artists reflect on their society and as well as on the present moment, whatever they write about or whatever they choose to stay silent about.
That makes perfect sense too. Okay, Tadhg, could I ask you to introduce the extract and the novel, and then read in Irish and in English, please?
Okay. So some Gaelic shite. Just joking. So this is a book called Madame Lazare. It's a novel I wrote in the Irish language, and it is the story of two women. One is an elderly woman, the woman of the title, Madame Lazare, who has lived all her life in Paris, in a Jewish community. The story that she has told the world is that she is from Estonia, and that as the Nazis were approaching her country in the 40s, that she managed to escape. She was the only member of her family who escaped. That she made her way to London, where she met a young Jewish volunteer who had come to join the force of Charles de Gaulle in London, and she fell in love. And they after the war, they moved to Paris, where they got married and lived the rest of their lives. And the other major character in the story is the old woman's granddaughter, whose name is Lavana, who grew up in this household. She was raised by her grandparents, and all her life she has been, proud of her Jewish heritage. She's been proud of her grandmother, although her grandmother is very closed and very secretive about her family of origin, and the stories that she tells are very, very limited, and most of the information that Levana has got about her grandmother's background is from her grandfather. So when the old woman, comes towards the end of her life and she succumbs to dementia, fragments of memory begin to emerge from her mind, which are completely puzzling to Levana, because they have nothing to do with this this Jewish heritage that the woman has espoused. In fact, she begins to speak a language that Levana initially presumes to be Estonian, although the old woman says that she has forgotten her native language. But then she discovers that the language that the old woman's speaking is Irish. And so the story then moves back and forward in time between Brussels at the recent past to the Aran Islands, which is an Irish-speaking, Gaelic-speaking island, 3 islands off the coast of the west of Ireland. And when we go back into this place, we discover the world of this young woman, or this child whose name was Murid, who grew up in an intensely Catholic home, kind of a folkloric Catholicism, where her father's stories were very much kind of woven with her sense of spirituality and her sense of her own relationship with her dead mother. So the story, I suppose, one of the kind of the spines of the story is the young woman Levana trying to figure out the truth about the background of her grandmother, and then the grandmother doing her very best to defend this secret that she has kept all her life, and the young woman finally finding out, why this has happened, how this could possibly have happened. So the short extract I'm going to read is it's when we first meet Levana, and she's in Brussels. She's a primary school teacher, and she is working in what the French artfully called quartier populaire. It's a poor neighborhood in Brussels. It's an immigrant community. There are many families from North Africa, Arabic-speaking Muslims, and Levana is teaching there. So this is a short scene from Levana's work day. First in Irish and then in English. The Buchalín be cúpa faoi in a World Town, a chligan catach fosci no as a lúnige, a dhéag snaidni ar a chéile. Bhí snagaracht chainte chatachtwai, coracle muchta a gélu rít an Ullagón. Bhí a tep go homlan ar Levana himrú. Ar a glún os a chóra bhí si a hédan ar ein level leis I a laurt leis an glór fáinach. Bhí gachtalta eile rang I mi a bhhaile le fichan nómed, agus mar le hárlaíoch go minic bhí seanmhathar sala dearnach a tíocht faoine dhéin. Rug Levana go séh ar gá rusta an Buchalín fechan sa bhéta tí áirde áil. Chúb sé siar tuile darda a cheán agus thugs fechant chráite éirí. Sit am moi, Lauro me le mamma Jalil madin jalún na sala. Juf me de rasta vérin. Me sit am moi. Deire sé agus chua ho fadal sin shelf tív le cúne na laurlana. Wan si an nuas bérin bán a bhí na híán. Nur hín si hig sala darda sé a cheán a iris le racht arabíse a chorwai. Hula si coscé minig a tíochta nuas an fosáiste agus an is cro or doracha méle daris. Bhí seanmhathar an Buchalín an faoi dheire I gléiste ó wathais go sáil mar a bhíocha gcónaí I seadúr dubh. Letha dá húl ar a meam nuair a thunig si an bhil chráite bhí ar an garlach. Nuair a glí si anam freaban Buchalín na heasa agus rithaice a thuma féin a godás dubh an seadúr a fuorchuoineachán leis a fean ama. Laur an teanmhathar leis an abertí gunta. Níor gá na focail a hiiscint leis an mí hásamh na glóra ahaint. Chas Levana, Lasser Rudach and Sula. C'est à lui l'ourson, madame. Où est-il? Vers een vanscha sauce de racka herrings vind geelsha. An berin buivi ymi awale le jalil an ladin gyudamach. E siw de chap gur leis heen gachrod sa shumra. Kenach ro Levana heen im on a ranga shach le shachten. Visak I hana heen gur gha súliérach an yal jalil. A laiad vi si tre sheka leis naher le kintu gur leis an dregan. Wich an fragra grod de fushi wai siw. E sin agus aber géir a hug le fis nar henne se leis go gestofi e heen náwag. Vi an tanwa hor inis a ransú tríwála sale go mi ainach an bochlín bega brenn sísan fechant an namsog sisan bérin nor nar airi le Levana tachter. Ach ni raide. Atoni, madame, der Levana dere. Jofi me Fatima, bei tún an gachra de vina de siúd. Vi Fatima san effig an frifgarish, I gargoint go tasi a wón le dyn y kins. Dan Levana le na hardal, nir an kinnal sha campel feki ac I riaf on rúni. I cyrdi fwyn garn brocach a vi bali tif mola shachten, an bala vi wai, slant in the bosh di cor hymwylige, I kinsa nach darlach a leider Avenue Leo Herrera no an valdu boide le cambre. Chyrsi dere burblis a gora agus leg si sa fón. Fatima at Levana Gamunta, la aitis at I gnirach an rúni racht ferige at I hain at I géad o dele. C'est la grand-mère de Salé. Come la cuidilum laurclé, ta fatis ar man rud mi cheart rá. Dairú Fatima dá cahéir agus amach léthe an tulc imiha go chumlan da hédan agus main winside at I mar a bhíoch go hundul. Vínu Levana scéile vérin ar a malach agus siomra ranga. Tá donas ar jalí le jar Fatima. An tahir a wali an scaile cur me geall. Sméids Levana cean. Tá cleachta go máthir dul trí na bhála sa le bhágan sin siomra ach tá tahir kiltoch go má. Is argan na nniuma chorála seanis. Laura mi leis an máthir te lún. Den nu wasil I siúd. Okay. Well, more on dini higimecha. Then enough words. There are 2 or 3 people who understand that. Okay. So now in English. So Levana, Brussels, 2015. The little boy had bundled himself into a ball, his curly head flopped onto knees drawn tightly to his chest. Levana could barely make out the odd, muffled word between his sobs. She sat on the floor before him, her voice a patient murmur. Sally ignored her. Every other child in the class had gone home 20 minutes ago, but as often happened, Sally's grandmother was late. Gently, Levana closed her grip on the little boy's wrists. He drew away suddenly, lifted his head and looked her in the eye. C'est à moi. I'll speak to Jalil's mom on Monday, Sally. We'll get your teddy back. Mais c'est à moi. Standing up, she went over to the library corner and reached for a white teddy sitting on one of the shelves. Sally looked up when she offered it to him, and this time let fly with a stream of Arabic. Footsteps echoed along the hall, and a tall, dark form appeared in the doorway. The little boy's grandmother was here at last. When she heard her grandson whimpering, her eyes widened. She called his name, and the little boy ran sobbing to her, flinging himself into her arms and burying his head in the black cotton of her chador. The woman spoke to the child in clipped sentences. Levana didn't need to understand her words to get what she was saying. She turned, giving Levana a belligerent look. C'est à lui l'ourson, madame. Où est-il? This woman could raise hell about her grandson's teddy. Another mother or grandmother would be understanding, but not this one. Although Levana had only been teaching the class for a week, she already knew that Jalil needed to be watched carefully. But at least she had covered herself. When she checked earlier with Jalil's father that the little bear actually belonged to his son, oui, was the terse response, followed by a look that told Levana that he did not appreciate being questioned. The grandmother was now rifling through Sally's school bag as the child looked on, hopeful that she could find the bear that Levana could not. But it wasn't there. Wait, madame, said Levana. I'll go and get Fatima. She might be able to help us. Fatima was in her office, opposite the main interest, in the middle of a heated telephone conversation. Levana had never before heard her sound so cross as she complained about a pile of rubbish outside the school that had been there for a week now, the stink of it and the risk it posed to the children's health. This would never happen on Avenue Leo Herrera or in Val du Bois de la Combe, she said. The conversation ended brusquely as she hung up. Fatima, said Levana tentatively, half afraid of the secretary's reaction, could you help me with a grandmother who's upset? Would you come with me to speak to her? I'm afraid I'll say the wrong thing. Fatima got up from her chair, once again her usual cheerful self. Levana explained the teddy bear saga on their way back to the classroom. Jalil, said Fatima. Right. I'll bet it was his father who picked him up from school. Levana nodded. His mother usually goes through his school bag before they leave, but the father's a bit difficult. It's best not to say too much to the grandmother. We'll speak to Sally's mother on Monday. She understands.
Thank you very much. And this was the whole novel actually is a really interesting engagement with Europe, which, to the best of my knowledge, is actually a fairly recent trend in Irish language writing. I mean, for historical reasons, I would suppose that it's only in the last few decades that more and more writers in Irish are actually not writing only about Ireland and have that kind of range that your novel does. So my question would be, if hard pressed, what would Europe mean to you as an Irish language writer?
Well, as I said earlier, it's a multicultural place. It's a wonderful tapestry of tribes and dialects and languages, and we have, I suppose, in the Irish-speaking world, because it's a minoritized language in Ireland, it's spoken by a relatively small population base. So it is, in a certain way, even though, you know, I do feel that so much of the culture of the English language is my culture. You know, I have happily consumed, you know, everything from The Sopranos to, you know, all sorts of Anglophone, Anglo-American literature and loved it. But still, to hold on to our beloved Irish language, you know, English is the problem in a certain way, because English is so enormous. It's such a gigantic kind of culture there, which is eating into, you know, the ground on which we stand as Irish speakers. So in one way, that was a reason for me as a writer to kind of reach out to Europe and to kind of try to make some imaginative connections with my story, because the Aran Island sections are very much based in that Gaelic world of folklore and song, which is very much alive in the Connemara in which I live. You know, traditional singing is I suppose the speciality. The Sean-nós singing is the speciality of Connemara, and that kind of oral literature and oral poetry is just a very natural part of the living culture. But to kind of weave it in with a contemporary Europe, and also the place that the Irish language has found in the labyrinthine world of European bureaucracy, that kind of fascinates me as well, because my eldest son is such an Irish speaking bureaucrat in Brussels, making his way and his living as an employee of the European Commission.
Could I ask you, did you first learn English or Gaelic?
Well, it's a kind of a complex question. I grew up speaking a sort of an English which is very flavoured by Irish, and it is my late father, and my mother is still alive, would speak a form of English which is greatly kind of coloured by Irish. She would, they would have a residual. They would have a residual kind of collection of vocabulary in Irish for which they had never found an English equivalent. Words about nature, words about the land, words about saving turf, which is a particularly Irish skill, which there was no English vocabulary for, and also descriptions of people, especially disparaging descriptions of people. There just was nothing like the the verb of an Irish word, you know, to put somebody down. So those words kind of survived. So then, as a teenager, I became passionate about the Irish language, and I sometimes say that it was kind of like, you know, was living like with this a kind of old rug that had been in the house all my life, and I was kind of used to the patterns of it. But then at a certain point when I became fluent in Irish, it was kind of like I flipped the rug over and there it was, this whole other thing in full colour. So that I had the kind of the skeleton of the whole thing in English, but then when I turned it around and I became fluent in Irish, it seemed like a sort of homecoming in a certain way.
When you go have a beer, do you speak? When you with your friends, let's say.
Well, with my Irish-speaking friends, I speak Irish. Yeah. So it's and we speak Irish in the home, and it's funny. We have 2 sons and 2 daughters, and for some reason that I can't quite understand, there's a PhD in it for a sociolinguist. But I speak Irish to my sons and English to my daughters, and that seems to be the way that it has evolved. It wasn't planned. Yeah. It's interesting.
Can I follow this up with one other question, and that is, you yourself mentioned, you know, how relatively few people actually speak Irish, and of course, of those, there'd be even fewer who actually read literature, as in, you know, you'd go and buy a novel, etc., which means that lively as it is and safe as it is as a language, Irish, it's never going to be commercially viable to write and publish in Irish. What does the Irish government do about this? What kind of support is available, and do you think it's enough?
Well, there is support available for publishing. There are a number of schemes both from the Irish Arts Council and from there's another funding organisation called Clár na Leabhar, the book publishing program, which is a government program, and they have a scheme where they fund publishers to commission writers to write work. So I mean, I think it's kind of like where some people, you know, decide to be a poet, for example, you know, and you know that's not the fast track to riches, you know, but it's something that you just kind of you're drawn to in a certain way, you know, it's something you're attracted to. And there is the possibility of being a bilingual writer as well. I mean, I have written for television in English, for example. And I could imagine I have ideas, you know, for non-fiction books, especially. I'd like to write in English. I think that would come more naturally to me to write that sort of thing in English. But I think I really want to stick to my guns in terms of writing fiction in Irish.
Fantastic, thank you very much. I mean, where I was heading with the question was more the publishing side of things. You know, you'd have the same in the theatre sector, for instance. You know, how can you support a theatre where you can never bank on large audiences? Of course, I wouldn't suppose that there are many writers anywhere in Europe who actually decide to become a writer because it's a good way to make a living. You know, there are relatively few of those, probably. Yeah.
Well, actually, it's interesting. Children's publishing in Irish has become, you know, relatively speaking, a lot more mainstream in the last 10 years than it was. And I know in my experience in publishing is that the print runs in Irish are relatively, you know, they're relatively respectable. Like 2,000 copies for a children's book is not at all unusual. 3,000 copies for say a translation of a well-known kind of brand, say from American brand or something like that. But for an original book, 2,000 copies wouldn't be unusual at all. And I think in terms of the smaller languages of Europe, that's not bad at all.
Absolutely fantastic. Yeah. Given the Czech experience and knowing some of the numbers, really well done. Yeah. Fabulous. Yeah. Now, I have a long list of questions here, but there's a danger of testing the patience of our audience. So I think I'll just forget about my questions and would like to hand over to the audience. If you have a question to any of the writers Please fire away.
I'd like to ask you a question about the language. You're Czech, Irish, and English writing authors, and this evening is happening in English entirely, for the simple reason that we all speak it. You know, it's and if this was to be interpreted, we'd be here till midnight. So the advantages of English being the universal language in many parts of the world are clear, but there are also many aspects that make me worry about this fact, and I wonder what you think about that.
I get very ashamed of it. Yeah, because I'm the one sitting on the panel that is in a very privileged position, and when I go around the world, and I do travel a lot, and nearly always all the other writers have to bend towards me, and I think you can own that, and then you can ask yourself what you do with it. And what I've been trying to do is read as much work in translation as I can, champion as many writers as I can from other places, try and help them find translators and publishers. And I know that doesn't solve the problem of English being this universal behemoth, but it does help writers from smaller places with smaller languages find audiences. But yeah, it is, it's weird to me. I was in Grenoble in France there about 6 weeks ago, and I was the only English-speaking author there. And for the whole weekend, everyone very graciously spoke to me in English. And I would love to not be in that position. And I think some of it is going to change. There are big languages out there that are starting to have huge markets. In places like China, and I think there will be some change in that, but it'll be slow. So sorry. No. I know you didn't mean it like that, but I often start out at things by saying I'm so sorry that everyone else has to do this in English for me.
Well, I don't know. I think thank God for English, that we can all make ourselves understood all over the world pretty much. And my language was more or less reconstituted in the 19th century because only peasants spoke the language, and everything that was of any importance was written and taught and learned in German in this part of the world. And for obvious reasons, for historical reasons, we abandoned German, and I think it was a shame for the sciences, etc. It just moved us backward somehow in terms of being able to compete on an international level in sciences and etc. But of course, every language is a source of knowledge and expression that is unique, and every language needs to be preserved, such as species of animals and flowers need to be preserved. I was very surprised, actually, and I'm again going to mention the international writing program with 30 international writers, many of them from Africa, who actually received their education in English. And I would consider that as a great advantage, because I had to put so much work into learning English that I was, jealous of them because they learned it for free, basically. But they are rediscovering their native languages, and they are very proud of them, and they are writing and encouraging people to write and read in those languages, which I can understand, but from a point of view of a society that has been there, that went through that process more than 100 years ago, I just was not sure that's the way forward. I know that's very. It's not very nice of me to say that when we have Irish guests and it's another minority language that needs to be cherished and preserved. But I'm not worried, and if I were able to write in English, I probably would, because just because I would be able to reach a much bigger audiences, and it would get, you know, the process of getting to readers would be so much easier. So sorry.
Well, the first foreign language I learned was Russian in school, and I'm glad I'm writing it in English.
Do you have priorities about which language you write what in? Because you've written both in English and in Czech.
Yeah, well, the language will go under a little bit. So if I'm in an American world, I would quickly start thinking and writing in English. People in my dreams, generally in America, speak English, and here they speak Czech. So partly it's a function of also, you know, who I'm writing for. When I'm here, I wrote for 25 years in English only, and I was living a completely American life. My kids spoke English. We spoke English at home all the time. I didn't see too many Czechs anymore. I was writing some letters in Czech. And then in the 90s, after the Velvet Revolution, a producer wanted me to write a screenplay adaptation of a Czech novel, The Wonderful Years That Sucked, by Vivek. And it was, I kind of approached it with trepidation because I hadn't been writing in Czech at all. But it was nonsense. It was crazy to try to write this Czech adaptation of a Czech novel for a Czech film in English and then translating it. So I wrote it in English, and I found out that it's in Czech rather, and I found out that it's still there. And after that, but it was kind of, it went under a little bit, and I had to lift it up. But now that I've been living here for 12 years, you know, I'm writing in Czech.
Thank you. I think it's time to give a big thank you to our 4 wonderful guests. We've discussed in you know, all kinds of ways the fact that Europe is, you know, a multicolored, multifaceted continent with multiple languages, but of course with multiple individualities. And we've just heard 4 extracts from wonderful but formally and in terms of content very different works. So thank you very much for joining me for this discussion.